Few characters of the 20th century exercised as much dominion over millions of lives as Iosif Vissarionovich Dzhugashvili, better known as Josef Stalin, who was born in a poor village in the Caucasus and ended up building an empire of absolute power. From his youth on the streets of Gori, where he learned to fear and strike before reasoning, to his silent rise among distrustful revolutionaries, he wove a web of control that reached every corner of the Soviet state. Distrustful by nature, he turned politics into a game of systematic elimination until no rival was left standing. He not only led a devastating war against Hitler, but also an internal war against his own people, marked by terror, surveillance and imprisonment. Isolated, old and feared, he was cornered by his own shadow, while those close to him silently awaited his fall. Amidst hidden files, persecuted doctors and whispered orders, the end came with a brutal irony. Alone, motionless, with no one daring to help him. How could such a powerful man die without a single one of his subordinates trying to save him? Childhood, poverty and hatred, the origins of the tyrant. After serfdom was eliminated in the year 1864, Ekaterine Galadzi's family settled in Gori. There, when she was 18 years old, she was married to the shoemaker Vissarion Dzhugashvili, known as Beso, who was 6 years older than her. Their first two children died young. The third was Iosif, who would later be called So-So. Little real documentation about Stalin's childhood is preserved, and almost everything known comes from memoirs written after he had already come to power. Even those who do not analyze these sources with too much scrutiny note that the memories do not describe a common child, but rather already present the one who would later become a dictator, which inevitably distorts the focus. This causes many details to be intentionally exaggerated or omitted. Depending on the author's point of view, either his talents and leadership traits or, on the contrary, an alleged innate cruelty and mental problems are highlighted. But as Ronald Sooney pointed out, trying to see the future tyrant in little Iosif is something very questionable. It is usually accepted as true that he had a complicated childhood. It is said that his father mistreated him and that they lived in scarcity, which would have filled the child with resentment and formed a cold and vengeful character. However, there are many facts that show a different reality. In many aspects, Stalin's childhood was quite common and even at times relatively stable. Some testimonies indicate that his father, besides being an experienced shoemaker, knew how to read in Georgian and could communicate in several languages, such as Russian. His mother had been homeschooled and also knew how to read and write in Georgian, which was an advantage in a region with a low educational level. During Iosif's first years of life, his father seemed to have some success, and the family lived without great privations. Over time, when Vissarion started drinking more often and ended up abandoning his wife and son, the care of the little one was left in Ekaterine's hands. She had a strong character, was hard-working, and after doing various jobs, she learned to sew and became a dressmaker. As an only child, something that would later be important, So-So did not have to dedicate himself to work like many other children his age, so he was able to study without interruptions. In a letter sent in 1950 by a former childhood friend who asked to meet with him to remember old times, he said, "In 1894, when you finished theological school, I finished Gori Municipal School. That same year you were accepted into the Tiflis Theological Seminary, but I could not continue studying because my father had 8 children and we were poor, so we had to help him." Iosif's mother, hoping that her son could change his destiny and become a priest, worked very hard to fulfill that goal, doing everything possible so that he could continue with his studies. That dedication does not match the widespread image of a miserable and dark childhood. Of course, there were difficult moments in the family. Vissarion, when he drank, was violent, and it is known that both he and the mother on some occasions resorted to beatings. However, as Sooney rightly points out with the data available, it cannot be said whether that type of behavior was especially unusual at that time and in that place, or if it had a particular impact on the worldview of little So-So. In reality, everything indicates that his childhood and adolescence were similar to those of other boys who grew up in an environment of modest artisans and merchants, but not in poverty, within a small city located on the margins of the empire. It was an environment where harsh rules coexisted with habits of mutual aid among neighbors and moments when the situation improved. During that early stage of his life, his mother was the one who supported him the most. She was in charge of protecting him from shortages, took care of him during illnesses such as smallpox, which left permanent marks on his face, and was the one who allowed him to receive an education. In addition, Soso suffered an accident in childhood that, combined with poor medical care, left his left arm seriously damaged. The joints became atrophied, and the arm never recovered its normal movement. He also had a birth defect. 2 fingers on his left foot were fused. It is very likely that these physical problems did not go unnoticed among the other children, but despite that, he was not rejected. He participated in games with others and socialized without difficulties. He had a very good memory, something that was highly valued at the time. It does not seem that his difficult childhood was the origin of the toughness that would later be seen in Stalin, nor are there clear signs that any particular rebellious impulse was already noticeable at that time. When it was time to start school, his mother received help from several people in the town who saw potential in the child and believed that an academic education could open up opportunities for him. Ekaterin's goal was for her son to become a priest, which was considered a respectable and socially upward path. At that time, that seemed like a suitable and possible goal. The lines of a Georgian poem that the young Iosif knew and repeated said, "A lark sings high in the sky, a cheerful nightingale says, 'Bloom, beautiful land, rise up, country of the Georgians, and you, Georgian, honor your homeland with your studies.'" These verses do not soften the figure of the adult Stalin, but they show that in his youth he had more idealistic intentions, focused on serving his country and his people. During his 3rd year at the seminary, those vague and still unformed aspirations led him to take a more decisive step. Iosif joined a clandestine discussion group formed by other seminarians, and apparently took on an active role within the group. The texts they read were legal, but were forbidden inside the seminary. There are conduct records from the school that indicate he was sanctioned for reading unauthorized books, including some novels by Victor Hugo, in the last months of 1896 and the beginning of 1897. From that moment on, Iosif's grades began to drop and rule infractions became more frequent. As he progressed in his studies, he changed. He stopped writing poems, something he used to do with enthusiasm, and became more strongly interested in political topics. The discussion group was no longer enough for him. He wanted to participate in something more concrete and real. That need led him to approach the Social Democrats, to learn about the ideas of Marxism, and to attend illegal meetings organized by railway workers. According to official records, in August of 1898, while still a student at the seminary, he joined a social democratic organization and began to work as a propagandist, sharing ideas among small groups of workers. It is likely that at that time his knowledge of Marxism was still very basic, but his interest was strong and absorbing. For him, that ideology, which seemed to have a total vision of society and which offered answers almost as if it were a religion, filled the space left by his disenchantment with traditional faith. The idea that human history followed fixed laws and that humanity was inevitably heading toward a model of social justice gave meaning to the revolutionary struggle. However, that enthusiasm for Marxism did not make him special. At that time, many young people shared that same ideological fervor, which was spreading like a trend. Among the influences that marked Iosif were also the older activists who came to Tiflis from other parts of Georgia. Through them, he got to know other political agitation environments, broader than the seminary halls. In his closest circle, it was already commented that he was becoming increasingly radical, which coincided with the loss of interest in his religious education. For the young man who had started studying with the hope of becoming a priest, the world had changed. Now he was attracted to politics and the idea of transforming the established order. That step was decisive and marked the end of his life as a religious student, although he still did not imagine the path he was going to take or the impact he would have decades later. From bandit to Bolshevik leader, the rise of the new chief. When the 20th century began, Stalin was already fully involved in clandestine activities. By then, he had already been arrested several times, had escaped on more than one occasion, and had a well-established reputation among revolutionary circles for his determination, his reserved nature, and his readiness for the most dangerous tasks. During the years leading up to the revolution of 1905, his work included printing leaflets, fundraising, organizing strikes and coordinating actions on behalf of the party, but also participating in expropriations, as the Bolsheviks called the robberies to finance their operations. The secret police had him on file as a dangerous element, and he constantly changed cities, hiding among sympathizers who housed him in basements, workers' dwellings, or country houses. His ability to move undetected made him a valuable resource for the movement, and although he was not a well-known figure outside internal circles, within the party he was already recognized for his effectiveness. Throughout those years, Stalin remained faithful to the hard line of Bolshevism and developed an identity increasingly focused on discipline, absolute loyalty, and the conviction that the end justified the means. He maintained contact with Lenin through letters and messengers, and although he was not part of his closest inner circle, their positions coincided on many key points. In his writings, he insisted on the need for a strong party with a centralized structure and ready to act decisively. His tone was dry, unadorned, and his arguments were focused on tactics and practice rather than philosophical principles. This way of thinking, direct and action-oriented, set him apart from other local leaders who preferred theoretical debates or endless discussions about strategy. For Stalin, the important thing was to advance the cause, regardless of the methods used. During the revolution of 1905, he had an active role in Georgia. He organized demonstrations, drafted proclamations, and participated in clashes with the regime's forces. His participation earned him new recognition within the movement, but also forced him to spend time in hiding or in exile. He was arrested again in 1906 and sent to Siberia, but he managed to escape after a few months, a skill he would repeat on other occasions. This stage consolidated his reputation as someone tough, capable of enduring extreme conditions and moving forward without complaining. He was not a brilliant orator or a deep thinker, but he was someone who kept his promises and knew how to stand firm even in the midst of chaos. In the following years, his connection with Lenin grew stronger. Although they still didn't see each other often, Stalin became one of his most consistent defenders within the party. When a meeting was organized in Prague in 1912 to reorganize the Bolshevik Party, Stalin was one of the key participants. There he was elected to be part of the Central Committee, a decisive step on his path to power. This appointment was not only a reward for his loyalty, but also a sign of the trust that Lenin was beginning to place in him. From then on, his name began to appear more frequently in the party's internal documents and in revolutionary publications, where he signed with different pseudonyms, the most famous of which was Stalin, which means of steel. As his responsibilities increased, so did his influence. Stalin was sent to various cities of the Russian Empire to coordinate Bolshevik activities, organize clandestine printing presses, and maintain contact between the different regional groups. These logistical tasks were essential for the functioning of the party and required a combination of discretion, firmness, and practical sense. Stalin stood out precisely for those qualities. He didn't get distracted by ideological discussions or seek prominence in debates. His priority was that the leadership's instructions were carried out without errors, and that resources got to where they were needed. In 1913, he was arrested again and deported to the north of Siberia, to a place so remote that there was almost no way to communicate with the outside world. This time he did not manage to escape, and he spent several years there. However, even in those conditions, he maintained contact with the party, received materials by mail, and participated in discussions from a distance. This stage was the longest of his detentions and kept him off the main stage until the fall of the Tsarist regime in 1917. When this happened and the provisional government was established, Stalin was freed along with thousands of political prisoners and immediately returned to Petrograd, where he quickly resumed his activities. His return coincided with a critical stage for the country. The February Revolution had overthrown the Tsar, but the new government was unstable and faced opposition from several sectors. The Bolsheviks, although still a minority, were reorganizing and preparing a political offensive. Stalin, now with experience, became an important figure in the Pravda newspaper, where he began to publish editorials that reflected the party's positions. In those texts, his style remained direct, unadorned, with a clear focus on tactics and organization. Although he was not yet part of Lenin's closest core, his influence on the party apparatus was growing. When Lenin returned from exile in April, the situation within the party changed. There were tensions between those who supported a more moderate line and those who, like Lenin, proposed moving toward a second revolution. Stalin, Although he initially didn't adopt a radical position, soon aligned with Lenin and supported his theses. This timely and strategic decision strengthened his relationship with the party leader and allowed him to get even closer to the leadership corps. He was elected to the executive committee of the Petrograd Soviet, a key body at that time, and participated in meetings where the future of the country was discussed. His role wasn't the most visible, but it was one of the most constant. During the following months, Stalin participated in the preparation for the seizure of power. He was involved in the planning of actions, the drafting of proclamations, and coordination with local Soviets. When the insurrection took place in October, Stalin was one of the most important operational pieces, although he didn't have a prominent role in the public part of the event. Once the Bolsheviks gained control of the government, his position within the state apparatus consolidated. He was appointed People's Commissar for Nationalities, a position that reflected both his Georgian origin and his ability to handle delicate issues. From there, Stalin began to build his network of allies, placing trusted people in key positions and ensuring that his orders were carried out without resistance. In those first years of the new regime, Stalin maintained a relatively low profile. While other Bolshevik leaders were dedicated to theoretical debates or personal disputes, he focused on consolidating structures, controlling resources, and ensuring that party decisions were applied in all regions. This work allowed him to gradually gain power without attracting too much attention. The trust that Lenin placed in him was growing, and although he wasn't exempt from criticism within the party, his position became increasingly solid. He was no longer just the effective organizer who operated in the shadows, but a leader with his own weight in the most important decisions of the revolutionary government. The price of power, purges, fear, and absolute control. When Stalin consolidated his position in the Bolshevik leadership, the state apparatus and the party began to transform into a system built around his figure. The ascent to power had required discipline and patience, but staying at the top demanded much more. From the early years, the fight against rivals became the center of his strategy. For Stalin, every adversary represented a threat, and the elimination of these enemies was a constant task, executed with precision and without concessions. His way of governing combined obsessive vigilance with the ability to sow fear among his own party comrades, while simultaneously cultivating an image of a leader close to the people. The process of concentrating power began with the marginalization of figures who had shared prominence in the revolution. Men like Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev, who at one time seemed indispensable, were gradually reduced to weak positions. Stalin used tactics that included the manipulation of internal votes, control of appointments, and the use of the propaganda apparatus. Each step was calculated to isolate the adversary and present Stalin as the true successor of Lenin. In this official narrative, he was the guardian of ideological purity and the only one capable of guiding the country towards socialism. At the same time, any criticism was presented as treason. During the 1920s, disputes within the party were disguised as theoretical discussions, but behind the texts and resolutions were intense personal struggles. Stalin was skillful at presenting himself as a moderate who sought unity, while pushing others to make mistakes. The temporary alliance with Bukharin and other leaders allowed him to defeat Trotsky, who ended up being expelled. Then, when his objective changed, Stalin turned the machinery against Bukharin and those who remained in his circle. The result was that toward the end of the decade, there was no longer any figure in the party with a comparable weight to his. The entire apparatus answered to him. The next step was to transform that control into absolute obedience. Stalin fostered a system in which personal loyalty was more important than competence or experience. The cadres who rose did so because they aligned with his instructions and showed public devotion to him. The cult of personality began to grow progressively. Portraits, slogans, and articles presented him as the wise guide, the legitimate heir of Lenin. Although in the first years this exaltation was limited, little by little it became omnipresent. The leader appeared in books, newspapers, and celebrations as the central figure of the victorious revolution and the construction of socialism. Simultaneously with the cultivation of that image, the practice of fear as a political tool spread. The secret police, first under the acronym GPU and then NKVD, became the arm in charge of monitoring the population and punishing any sign of disobedience. Denunciations, searches, and arrests began to become part of daily life. What in the 1920s had been applied in a limited way against declared opponents was extended to cover entire sectors of society. The purges were not limited to Stalin's old rivals, but reached bureaucrats, technicians, military personnel, and even ordinary citizens accused of hostile attitudes. One of the decisive moments was the start of the 5-year plans and forced collectivization. The goals set by Stalin were so high that they were impossible to meet without resorting to extreme methods. The pressure on local leaders was enormous, and any delay or insufficient figure was interpreted as sabotage. This created a circle in which regional authorities falsified results to avoid being accused, while the repression against peasants and workers intensified. Millions of people were displaced, accused of being kulaks or enemies of the people, and deported to remote regions. Collectivization brought hunger, violence, and discontent, but in official reports it appeared as a victory. The human price of these policies was deliberately concealed. The internal purges in the party reached an unprecedented level during the 1930s. Public trials became carefully prepared spectacles, in which former leaders confessed to absurd crimes after being subjected to pressure and torture. Zinoviev, Kamenev, Bukharin, and other Bolshevik veterans were accused of conspiring with foreign powers or planning assassinations. The confessions, obtained through threats and mistreatment, were broadcast as proof of betrayal. The subsequent executions were justified as necessary measures to protect the socialist state. With each trial, Stalin eliminated potential rivals and reinforced the idea that only he guaranteed the stability of the country. The security apparatus played a central role in this process. The political police chiefs were appointed and fell according to the leader's convenience. No one was safe, not even those in charge of executing the purges. The heads of the NKVD were replaced, and in many cases also shot when they were no longer useful. This mechanism created an atmosphere of terror in which every official knew that their fate depended on Stalin's will. Absolute obedience became the only protection, although even that loyalty might not be enough. The army, which represented a possible focus of resistance, was also hit. High-ranking officers who had played a leading role in the civil war were accused of conspiring and executed. Thousands of officers were arrested or sent to labor camps. The consequence was that, at the beginning of the Second World War, the Soviet military structure was weakened, although the propaganda ensured that it was more solid than ever. For Stalin, the elimination of possible internal adversaries was more important than military preparation. The message was clear. The security of the regime depended only on the elimination of any shadow of opposition. While fear spread, the cult of personality reached a level never seen before. Stalin's image was presented as that of an infallible leader, father of the peoples and supreme guide. In speeches and publications, he was attributed with almost superhuman qualities. Official biographies erased uncomfortable episodes and highlighted his achievements. In schools, factories, and collective farms, people were taught to venerate him as the incarnation of socialism. The dates of his life were celebrated as historical events. Even minor criticisms were seen as attacks on the state itself. Thus, forced devotion to the leader became an essential part of political and social life. The effect of this dynamic was the creation of a closed and self-referential system. No one dared to question decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. The reports sent to Moscow were filled with exaggerated figures and success stories because presenting problems was risking being accused of sabotage. The result was that Stalin received filtered and distorted information, which reinforced his view that enemies were everywhere and that only repression could maintain control. This circle of distrust constantly fed back on itself, creating an atmosphere in which repression was justified as a permanent necessity. The human cost of these policies was immense. Millions of people were arrested, deported, or executed. Entire families were destroyed. Fear became part of daily life, not only among the leaders, but in every neighborhood, in every factory, and in every town. Denunciations multiplied, because accusing another could be a way to save oneself. The social fabric was deeply altered, and entire generations grew up in an atmosphere of suspicion and silence. The repression not only eliminated real or imaginary enemies, but also served to keep the population in a state of constant submission. The paradox was that while repression intensified, Stalin's public image reached levels of veneration. Propaganda showed a leader close to the workers, concerned for children, tireless in his work for the country. Carefully selected photographs and official texts portrayed him as a humble leader, simple in his customs and dedicated to the welfare of the people. This representation contrasted with the reality of a system based on surveillance, fear, and the systematic elimination of opponents. But in a context where information was controlled and critical voices were silenced, propaganda was effective. At the end of the 1930s, Stalin had achieved what seemed impossible, to transform a party of revolutionaries into an apparatus of total obedience. The old Bolsheviks had been eliminated, the army had been purged, the population lived under surveillance, and the leader was revered as an undisputed figure. The price of that power had been enormous, with countless victims and a society traumatized by fear. But from the regime's perspective, the main objective had been achieved: absolute control. Stalin no longer had rivals, and his authority could not be questioned. The road to war and new challenges would open from that position of strength, built on the basis of purges, terror, and personal worship. The master of war, Stalin against Hitler and his own generals. When the war began in June 1941, Stalin was at the peak of his power. He had eliminated almost all of his old rivals, had transformed the party into a machine of obedience, and had established a system of terror that extended from the high command to the daily life of the population. However, that same structure generated weaknesses that became evident in the first months of the German invasion. The purge of the army had left the military institution without a large part of its experienced officers, and although propaganda showed an image of strength, the reality was that the Red Army was ill-prepared to face the attack. The pact with Hitler, signed in 1939, had given the Soviet Union a temporary reprieve. In Stalin's eyes, that agreement assured him time to rearm and reorganize his forces. But when reports arrived that Germany was preparing to attack, Stalin preferred to ignore them or consider them deliberate provocations. Convinced that Hitler would not break the pact so soon, he minimized the warnings from his intelligence services. That attitude contributed to the Soviet army being surprised on June 22, 1941, when Operation Barbarossa began. The German offensive spread rapidly, and within a few weeks, Wehrmacht troops occupied vast territories, captured hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and advanced toward the heart of the country. The first days after the attack were chaotic. Stalin secluded himself in his residence, and according to the testimonies of some of his collaborators, for a time he was paralyzed, unable to give clear orders. However, he soon regained control and presented himself as the determined leader who called on the people to resist. At the end of June, he spoke on the radio, addressing citizens in a solemn tone in which he invoked brothers and sisters to defend the homeland. From that moment on, his role was transformed into that of supreme commander, taking into his own hands not only politics, but also military leadership. Stalin's management of the war was marked by a combination of errors, rigidity, and brutality. From the beginning, he ordered his troops to resist without retreating, which led to many units being surrounded and destroyed. For him, any retreat was synonymous with cowardice or treason. In August 1941, he signed an order that forbade surrendering, establishing that those who surrendered to the enemy would be considered deserters. Thousands of Soviet soldiers were executed by their own officers for trying to flee from combat. This iron-fisted policy caused innumerable human losses, but at the same time, it reinforced the idea that there was no alternative but to resist to the end. Despite these decisions, the situation at the front continued to deteriorate. The Germans were advancing toward Moscow, and the capital was under direct threat at the end of 1941. At that time, Stalin decided to remain in the city. He refused to move the government, and in October, when panic was spreading, he ordered that urban defenses be prepared. His presence in Moscow was used as a symbol of resistance. In November, during the anniversary celebration of the revolution, he delivered a speech in Red Square, with troops parading directly toward the front. That gesture became one of the most remembered episodes of the war, presented as proof of his firmness. The counter-offensive in December, with the support of winter and the arrival of reinforcements, allowed the Soviets to stop the German advance on Moscow. It was a key moment that showed that the Soviet Union was not defeated. From then on, the war was transformed into a prolonged conflict in which Stalin assumed even greater control. He created defense committees, centralized the economy to produce weapons, and moved entire factories to the east of the country, away from the reach of bombings. Millions of workers and peasants were mobilized to sustain the war effort. Discipline was imposed in all aspects of life, and political surveillance accompanied every step of production and the front. Stalin's brutal leadership was also reflected in how he treated his own generals. He didn't hesitate to remove them, demote them, or even imprison them when he considered they had failed. Distrust was constant, and the officers knew that one mistake could cost them their lives. However, as the war progressed, Stalin learned to trust some of his most capable commanders, such as Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Konev. Although he maintained the final say in strategic decisions, he began to rely on their plans and accept recommendations. That process, slow and full of tensions, was key to improving the effectiveness of the Soviet army. The Battle of Stalingrad, between 1942 and 1943, marked a turning point. The city, which bore the leader's own name, became a symbol of resistance. Stalin ordered it to be defended at all costs. The fighting was fierce, and the civilian population suffered in an extreme way, trapped in the midst of the destruction. The Soviet victory, with the surrender of the 6th German Army, changed the course of the war. From then on, the initiative passed more and more into the hands of the Red Army. Propaganda presented the triumph as proof of Stalin's genius, further reinforcing the cult of his personality. After Stalingrad came other successful operations, such as Kursk in 1943, where the Soviets resisted the German armoured attack and then went on the offensive. The industrial power rebuilt in the east allowed for the production of enormous quantities of tanks, planes, and artillery. The coordination between the rear and the front became a decisive advantage. Stalin personally supervised the general strategies and closely followed the troop movements, while continuing to repress any sign of weakness. The repression reached both soldiers accused of cowardice and civilians suspected of disloyalty. Millions of prisoners of war and deportees suffered extreme conditions in camps and colonies. The advance toward the west from 1944 showed the magnitude of Soviet power. Massive offensives pushed German forces out of Soviet territory and led the Red Army to Poland, the Balkans, and finally Germany. Every victory was presented as a personal achievement of Stalin. In conferences with the Allies, such as in Tehran and Yalta, he presented himself as a firm and calculating leader, determined to ensure not only the defeat of Hitler, but also the expansion of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. Diplomacy went hand in hand with the military offensive, and the result was that at the end of the war the Soviet Union had considerably expanded its sphere of control. The human losses were enormous. Tens of millions of Soviet citizens died during the conflict, both in combat and as a result of the German occupation, internal repression and privations. However, the official narrative insisted that the sacrifice had been necessary and glorious. Stalin was presented as the great strategist and savior of the homeland. The victory parade in Moscow in May 1945 showed the celebrated generals, but the central place was occupied by the leader. His image was inseparably associated with the triumph over Nazism. The price of victory was very high, but for Stalin it meant the definitive confirmation of his power. Not only had he survived the invasion, but he had emerged strengthened. The Soviet Union emerged from the war as one of the two world superpowers, and Stalin's personal prestige was at its highest point. Inside the country, his control was total. Repression, far from decreasing, continued. The war had been used as a justification to intensify surveillance and punishment, and when the conflict ended, that apparatus was not dismantled. The lesson that Stalin learned from the war was that terror and discipline could guarantee the survival of the regime and expand its power. In his dealings with the Allies, Stalin showed the same mixture of toughness and pragmatism that characterized his internal policy. He accepted compromises when they suited him, but always with the intention of expanding Soviet influence. The division of Europe into zones of control was a direct consequence of those negotiations. While in the West he was seen as an uncomfortable but necessary partner, within the Soviet Union he was revered as the supreme leader who had guided the country to victory. The contrast between the real devastation and the propagated image was enormous, but in a state where information was controlled, the official version prevailed without discussion. At the conclusion of the war, Stalin had gone from being the leader of an isolated country battered by internal purges to becoming the undisputed head of an empire that extended over half of Europe. His figure was presented as that of the absolute victor, the master of war who had defeated Hitler and who imposed his authority both in the military and in the political field. The memory of his initial errors, the immense losses, and the brutality of his decisions was buried under the narrative of victory. The cult of his personality reached never-before-seen dimensions, with his image omnipresent in every corner of the country. For the Soviet people, marked by pain and destruction, the figure of Stalin appeared as the representation of triumph and survival, although that triumph had had an incalculable human cost. Paranoia, treachery, and isolation, the cornered dictator. In the years following the victory in the war, Stalin became the most powerful leader of the Soviet Union and one of the most influential men on the planet. However, that same position led him to a state of growing distrust that marked his last years. The military triumph gave him prestige, but it also deepened his conviction that only through constant vigilance and repression could he maintain control. The combination of absolute power and personal fear produced a stage in which the circle around him became smaller and smaller, while suspicions and purges continued. After 1945, the Soviet Union presented itself as a victor in the war and a global power. Stalin appeared as the main architect of the victory, the commander who had guided the country through destruction and had led it to occupy a place among the victors. However, the human price had been immense, and the reconstruction of the country became an enormous task. In that process, Stalin maintained his style of centralized and distrustful leadership. Economic, political, and military decisions continued to pass through his hands, and any disagreement was interpreted as a threat to his authority. The post-war political climate was marked by continuous repression. Although the external enemy was now the Western Bloc, especially the United States and its allies, Stalin never stopped seeing internal enemies in his own country. The Cold War began to take shape, and the Soviet leader reinforced control over Eastern Europe, imposing communist governments under Moscow's orbit. At the same time, internally, the security apparatuses maintained pressure on intellectuals, national minorities, and anyone who could be accused of anti-Soviet attitudes. For Stalin, vigilance was never enough, and the shadow of betrayal seemed to be always present. The last years of his life were marked by that obsession. As he aged, his health deteriorated, and his character became even more distrustful. The circle of collaborators was reduced to a very small group of leaders who accompanied him in meetings and nightly dinners. Figures like Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, and Bulganin participated in those gatherings, but everyone knew that they could fall from grace at any time. The conversations extended until the early hours of the morning, with abundant food and discussions that mixed matters of state with personal anecdotes, always under the shadow of suspicion. In that environment, no one felt safe, and every gesture was observed and evaluated by the leader. The repression against cultural and scientific sectors intensified. In the post-war period, Stalin promoted campaigns against intellectuals accused of cosmopolitanism or sympathies with the West. Writers, artists, and academics were publicly criticized, removed from their posts, or arrested. National minorities also became targets. In Crimea, Chechnya, and other regions, entire communities were deported under the accusation of collaboration with the German invaders. These mass displacements showed that even after the war, Stalin continued to rely on the same tools of control that he had used during the purges of the 1930s. International tensions served to justify new repressive measures. The formation of the Western Bloc, the Marshall Plan, and the creation of NATO were presented as proof that the Soviet Union was surrounded by enemies. In that context, Stalin reinforced his internal control. Propaganda showed him as the defender of socialism against imperialist aggression, while in practice surveillance of the population became stricter. Every external crisis was used to further tighten control, and the atmosphere of the Cold War was mixed with internal fear. In his last years, the leader also showed a growing interest in security and conspiracy matters within his immediate circle. The so-called doctor's plot was one of the clearest episodes of that paranoia. In the early 1950s, several Jewish doctors from the Kremlin were accused of conspiring to assassinate Soviet leaders. The accusation, fabricated from supposed intelligence reports, reflected Stalin's distrust even toward those who were in charge of his health. The case became a symbol of the last months of his regime, where suspicion reached all levels. Personal isolation became more pronounced. Stalin spent long periods in his residences, receiving reports and summoning his collaborators at all hours. The meetings could last until dawn, and in them the leaders tried to interpret his words and anticipate his reactions. No one could be sure what their fate would be the next day. The discipline of fear continued to mark the relationship with the leader, and each of his decisions could mean the promotion or the sudden downfall of an official. The internal purges did not disappear. Although they did not have the magnitude of the trials of the 1930s, arrests and dismissals continued. Ministers, generals and officials at different levels could be accused of treason, espionage or negligence. The logic was always the same: to keep fear alive to ensure obedience. In practice, this generated a system where individual initiative was blocked because any risky proposal could be interpreted as a threat. The result was an increasingly rigid apparatus dependent on Stalin's personal will. His health began to deteriorate more visibly in the late 1940s. Medical reports mentioned hypertension, heart problems and fatigue, but Stalin himself refused to show weakness. Even so, his lifestyle, with long nights of work, heavy meals and constant tension, accelerated the decline. The close circle noticed his mood swings, his prolonged silences, and his unpredictable reactions. The leader, who had survived decades of internal struggles and the most devastating war, was now faced with his own fears. Isolation became greater and greater. Although he continued to receive information from all sides, Stalin distrusted the data and suspected manipulation. The meetings with the Politburo became more sporadic, and many decisions were made directly by him, without broad consultations. Collaborators were limited to executing orders and waiting for his approval. This model of leadership, which had worked for years, was now showing its limits. Paranoia, treachery and isolation, the cornered dictator. In the years following the victory in the war, Stalin became the most powerful leader of the Soviet Union and one of the most influential men on the planet. However, that same position led him to a state of growing distrust that marked his last years. The military triumph gave him prestige, but it also deepened his conviction that only through constant vigilance and repression could he maintain control. The combination of absolute power and personal fear produced a stage in which the circle around him became smaller and smaller, while suspicions and purges continued. After 1945, the Soviet Union presented itself as a victor in the war and a global power. Stalin appeared as the main architect of the victory, the commander who had guided the country through destruction and had led it to occupy a place among the victors. However, the human price had been immense, and the reconstruction of the country became an enormous task. In that process, Stalin maintained his style of centralized and distrustful leadership. Economic, political and military decisions continued to pass through his hands, and any disagreement was interpreted as the body on the floor, the most solitary death of the Red Empire. On Saturday, February 28th, Stalin retired to rest at his residence in Kuntsevo, a simple and unluxurious house. Upon arriving there, he locked himself in his room as he usually did. That day he didn't summon anyone, make calls or give orders. Hours passed, and as night fell, the members of his closest circle, accustomed to staying alert, awaited a sign. However, there was no movement, no footsteps or doorbell. The service guards, following long-received instructions, were not to disturb the leader under any circumstances. Thus, silence completely filled the house. Throughout the night, the sentinels watching the main entrance did not detect any activity. The house remained in total calm, as if it were uninhabited. The custom was to wait for him to call or ring the bell himself. The head of the detachment assigned to security control decided not to act. After several hours had passed, the apprehension grew among the staff, although no one dared to break the established rules. The idea of disturbing the leader without an explicit order was seen as a serious offense. No one wanted to take on that responsibility. When Sunday dawned, everything was still the same. Although it was common for Stalin to sleep late, something seemed different that day. Some began to wonder if he was sick, but they still decided to wait. The assistants who usually received instructions to prepare breakfast or turn on the radio were still not called. The room door remained closed and no noises were heard from inside. The hours passed and the tension increased, although the fear of taking the initiative paralyzed everyone. It wasn't until Sunday night that one of the workers, encouraged by the insistence of his colleagues, decided to approach the room. He knocked softly without getting a response. He carefully opened the door and found him lying on the floor, in his pajamas, face up, unconscious. His left arm was extended while the right seemed contracted. There was a faint trail of urine on the floor, and his face showed signs of having suffered a strong physical impact. Although he was still breathing, he couldn't speak or move. Almost 24 hours had passed since he was last seen standing. The scene provoked a mixture of panic and confusion among those present. No one knew who to call first. The protocol for a medical emergency had never been fully clarified. An attempt was made to contact the Kremlin doctors, but there was a significant delay. During that time, Stalin remained on the floor without receiving attention. Despite the urgency, the call to the doctors was not made immediately. Some officials thought they should first notify the Minister of State Security. Others believed they should wait for someone from the political circle to authorize access. Finally, after several hours had passed, the doctors arrived at the residence. The team that entered was nervous and did not have a clear diagnosis. They evaluated his state and confirmed that he had suffered a stroke. His body showed paralysis on one side, and his blood pressure was very high. The stiffness of his limbs and the frozen expression on his face left no doubt about the seriousness of the condition. Although his breathing was still constant, he did not react to stimuli. Throughout Monday, he remained in the same state. His bed was carefully adapted and wet bandages were placed on his forehead. The doctors, limited in resources and without clear instructions, applied compresses and waited for some sign of improvement. No one took charge of the treatment. The high-ranking officials who arrived later, such as Beria and Malenkov, were restless, although they did not make firm decisions. Instead of ordering an immediate intervention, they spent long hours observing and commenting in low voices. The residence became a cold and silent space. The atmosphere became tense. The guards remained firm in their posts, and the employees avoided making eye contact. The fear of making a mistake or acting without permission intensified with each passing minute. Meanwhile, Stalin remained motionless, breathing with difficulty, without anyone doing much more than observing. The voices in the hallways were whispers, and any action was debated with fear. On Tuesday, the doctors noticed a slight decrease in his pulse and changes in his coloring. Despite this, no new treatments were introduced. The routine of applying compresses and measuring his vitals was maintained. No one openly questioned what was happening. The idea that he could die was present, but it was not spoken about. His closest subordinates took turns watching him, not daring to intervene beyond the basics. The power he exerted, even from his immobile bed, kept them paralyzed. On Wednesday at noon, his breathing became slower. The doctors no longer expected a recovery. Rigidity was spreading throughout his body, and his skin was turning pale. In the afternoon, his vital signs became barely perceptible. At 9:50 p.m., his heart stopped beating. No one cried or screamed. The inevitable was simply confirmed. His body, which for decades had been a symbol of absolute authority, now lay lifeless in a room where no one had dared to act in time. After his death, the officials present exchanged few words. The uncertainty about what to do next was evident. There was no established plan. A medical report was drafted that described the cause of death in general terms. The official version avoided mentioning the hours in which he did not receive help. It was announced that he had died of natural causes, without going into details. During the following days, the funeral arrangements were organized. The body was taken to the Kremlin, where a solemn ceremony was prepared. The people were invited to pay homage, although many were unaware of what had actually happened at the dacha. The version that was spread spoke of a quick death without suffering, hiding the abandonment and fear that marked his last hours. The image of the strong leader was kept intact in announcements and newspapers. What happened at the Kuntsevo residence was buried under the silence of those who surrounded him. No one took responsibility. Some guards were transferred. Other employees were briefly questioned, without any concrete measures being taken. The doctors were instructed not to talk about what had happened. Everything was closed with a brief and unchallenged official report. Thus ended the life of one of the most powerful men of the century. The fear he instilled in life accompanied him until the end. His death was not a glorious act or a heroic scene, but a reflection of the distrust and silence that he had sown around him for decades. Lies behind the coffin, the last crime. During the first days of March 1953, while in the Kremlin's corridors whispers about what had really happened at the Kuntsevo dacha were still heard, Stalin's body remained motionless, surrounded by silence and doubts. The official information, quickly released, spoke of a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Although it offered no details, the message sought to nip any speculation in the bud. However, subsequent events only fueled the murmur. The coffin was taken to the Hall of Columns of the House of Trade Unions, and there for 3 days an endless crowd paraded. While the people crowded the streets, amidst sincere tears and contained fears, the core of Soviet power had already reorganized. Beria, one of the most feared men of the regime, was the first to speak on the 5th day of March. In a measured tone he announced the leader's death and, without pause, began to introduce the new members of the Presidium. By his side were Malenkov, Molotov, Kaganovich, and other men who, for years, had feared Stalin. Now, with his absence, they acted with a mixture of caution and ambition. Beria's name stood out because it was he who, after confirming the death, ordered the rooms of the dacha to be closed and moved Stalin's personal documents, making sure that no one else had access to them. The internal security cameras stopped working for hours. In that time, Beria moved through the dictator's hallways and offices as if he was already in control. According to some witnesses, they saw him smile, something he hadn't done for years. His attitude contrasted with that of other members of the inner circle, who still walked cautiously. Meanwhile, the health authorities prepared the body for the funeral and took charge of keeping the official version intact. There was no public autopsy or free access to the body. Everything was managed by a small group of doctors under strict supervision. On the 6th day of March, a communiqué detailed that Stalin had suffered a cerebral hemorrhage accompanied by paralysis in the right half of his body. They added that his condition worsened due to heart failure and respiratory problems. The report, drafted with technical terms, avoided going into explanations about why no one attended to him for hours or who was the last to see him alive. Despite its medical tone, many saw in that text a strategy to close the case without further questions. The people, for their part, accepted the news as it came. Some, upon hearing it, fainted. Others cried inconsolably. Many simply remained silent. During the funeral, the atmosphere in Moscow was tense. The human tide trying to say goodbye to the leader became uncontrollable. Dozens of deaths were recorded due to asphyxiation or trampling. No one gave official figures, but rumors circulated quickly. In the hall where the body rested, the parade did not stop. Behind the coffin, a row of leaders kept their faces serious, while thousands of people passed in front of them. The posters exalted the legacy of the man who had guided the country in the war, industrialized the nation, and eliminated his enemies. Nothing was said about the camps, the purges, or the executions. That same day, while speeches praised Stalin's figure, Beria took another step. He initiated a campaign to review the files of several detainees, especially those involved in the so-called case of the White Coats. That process, which involved several Jewish doctors accused of wanting to assassinate Soviet leaders, had been promoted by Stalin a few months earlier. Beria, in his attempt to present himself as a reformer, declared that the confessions obtained were unreliable. He ordered the release of some doctors and the temporary closure of the investigation. Although his motives were strategic, many within and outside the party interpreted the gesture as an attempt to correct past excesses. In the following weeks, Beria's figure grew. He controlled the key ministries and presented himself as the face of the new leadership. However, his provocative style and repressive past generated mistrust. Molotov, Kaganovich, and others knew that if they didn't act fast, Beria would consolidate a power similar to Stalin's. Thus, while the people were still processing the loss, a new confrontation was brewing in the halls of power. Every decision was watched carefully, every gesture interpreted as a sign. Stalin's death had not brought calm, but a silent battle to occupy the space he had left. The funeral was concluded with a ceremony in Red Square. The body was deposited next to Lenin in the mausoleum. Crowds continued to fill the streets, and propaganda repeated the message of unity and continuity over and over again. In factories, schools, and barracks, tribute ceremonies were held. Everything had to seem stable. However, at the top, the reality was different. Alliances were breaking, secret archives were being reviewed, and paranoia, far from disappearing, remained alive. Even dead, Stalin continued to set the pace for a country that didn't know how to move forward without him. Klevniuk, in the documents reviewed after the partial opening of the Soviet archives, highlights that Beria's figure was carefully eliminated months later. He was arrested in July, accused of treason, and executed before the end of the year. His fall was fast and planned. The same people who supported him in March turned against him in July. The message was clear: no one should shine too brightly. After Beria's purge, Malenkov assumed a more moderate role, and Nikita Khrushchev began to gain influence. From then on, a stage of adjustments began, where some excesses of the past were slowly recognized, but without touching the core of the system. Silence was once again imposed. In the cultural field, Stalin's death also had concrete and measurable consequences, as some writers began to write texts in private, where they questioned his figure but did not yet dare to publish them, because the fear persisted and the leader's image was still hung in offices, schools and stations, while his name continued to be pronounced with respect. Although the regime was beginning to change hands, his influence did not disappear. The case of the white coats was officially closed, and the released doctors returned to their homes, marked by the experience but without anyone apologizing or publicly recognizing the error, in a closing without explanation. In the cities, the population continued to live under the same rules, and although arbitrary arrests decreased, state control remained firm. The agents of the Ministry of Internal Affairs were still active, and rumors about new trials or investigations continued to circulate. The official message was that everything was under control, that the party remained strong, and that Stalin's line would continue to guide the future, although in the corridors of the Kremlin another story was told. Because the internal struggle, the betrayals and the search for power had not ended, they had only changed faces. That March of 1953 was, in appearance, a month of transition. In reality, it was the forced closing of one stage and the beginning of another, just as uncertain. The figure of Stalin was elevated to the maximum in his death, even when those who surrounded him in life were already beginning to dismantle his legacy. In the midst of the smoke of the tributes and the slogans, the truth of his end was hidden. A lonely man, fallen in his room without help, ignored for hours. And afterward, a country that out of fear or strategy decided not to look back.